November 1974, Wichita, Kansas. The city was gripped by fear as a serial killer was attacking people in their own homes before binding, torturing, and ultimately killing them in pursuit of the thrill.
The police found semen at the scene, so there was clearly a sexual element to this offending. And they also discovered that the faces of some of the victims were quite bloated, which suggests that the killer strangled them and then stopped strangling them and then strangled them again.
The man behind these gruesome killings was living amongst his victims in the very town he was terrorizing.
He is a man who, for all intents and purposes, was upright citizen, and yet, while he was that on the surface, underneath there is no question at all, he was a monster.
His evil is a different evil, mainly because he thinks that he's entitled to it.
His name was Dennis Rader, but he would go on to create a murderous alter ego for himself, a brand of his own.
Rader would stalk his victims. He would attack them in their homes. He would torture them and kill them.
Rader's preferred method of murder, to bind, torture, and then kill, became his name, BTK. It took over 30 years for authorities to bring him to justice.
Wichita didn't have a boogeyman, they had BTK.
His gruesome crimes make Dennis Rader one of the world's most evil killers. January 1974, Wichita, Kansas. One of the world's most notorious serial killers began a reign of terror that would last over 3 decades.
I think the thing that makes Dennis Rader one of the world's most evil killers is the sheer conceit and arrogance that runs through every vein of his body.
The Otero family had just moved into the area where Dennis Rader lived. They became his first victims. He killed 2 children and their parents, leaving their other children to discover his crimes.
Dennis Rader's first murder, he's chosen to kill 4 people. That is quite a significant undertaking. And I think that really is testament to his arrogance and his hubris, that he thought he could do this.
A pillar of the community, involved in the church and a scout leader, Rader would go on to kill another 6 times, with his last murder taking place in 1991 when he attacked Dolores E Davis in her home.
He's on a Cub Scout camp, which he slips away from, clearly supposed to give him an alibi. Once again, binds her, tortures her, and eventually kills her. This time with her own pantyhose. And he dumps her body a long way away.
But this killer's ego and new technology meant that he was finally in the sights of police and the FBI after he wrote to local newspapers and a TV station to brag about the murders he'd got away with.
If he'd have just sat there and kept his mouth shut, I'm not sure we'd ever caught him. And so, you know, that kind of arrogance and complacency came back to bite him pretty hard.
Rader liked to torture people, and that wasn't just his murder victims, it was the families of his murder victims. So when he has the opportunity to relive and to retell the stories of the horrendous acts that he's perpetrated, he really does seize on that. He enjoys revealing all of the explicit and the gory details.
For the decades he remained uncaught, Wichita, the largest city in the sunflower state of Kansas, lived in terror of the killer who'd named himself BTK, bind, torture, kill.
With killers like Rader, there is always knock-on effects. And someone who is killing in such a way over a period of time is going to damage the community. There is going to be fear. There's going to be looking out of the curtains at the neighbours. It just breeds an appropriate paranoia amongst people. When's it going to happen next? Who's it going to be next?
When he was finally arrested in 2005, his reign of terror came to an end. But even then, he revelled in the attention.
Rader confessed he didn't deny having committed these murders, and actually I think he quite enjoyed having that notoriety. Finally, people knew who BTK was.
This killer's story begins in 1945. He was born in Pittsburgh, Kansas on March the 9th, the eldest of 4 boys born to William and Dorothea Rader.
Rader was born in 1945, and he was one of several children within a very traditional nuclear family. His father was strict, but not particularly abusive, and many children grew up in households like this.
He was upright, he was a scout, he was on all sorts of programs for good children. He had the ability to blend in. He wasn't bullied, for example, as a lot of killers are.
To his friends and family, he was a model child, but in private, Rader began to show his true colours.
Rader claims that when he was a youngster, he abused animals, so he hung a cat and he hung a dog. We do see, in quite a few cases of serial killers, animal harm in the background.
As he went into puberty, he described himself as looking at girly mags, developing a fascination with underwear, and then, significantly, and indeed deeply significant in his later crimes, was a fascination with bondage and sadomasochism.
Having graduated from a local high school in Wichita, in 1965, Rader enrolled in Kansas Wesleyan College in Salina, 90 miles from home. However, he dropped out.
In 1966, when Rader was 21, he joined the United States Air Force and remained in it for 4 years. He worked on systems. He was that kind of man. Systems are very much his kind of thing. He served abroad, sometimes in Europe. As far as we know, not a particularly distinguished career, but not a bad one. He returns to Wichita, Kansas, and marries a girl he was at school with.
Rader marries and has 2 children, and from the outside they do very much look like the respectable cereal box family, just like any other regular American family.
In 1974, Rader suddenly and inexplicably changed from the respected ex-forces gentleman to a brutal evil killer.
There has to be something that set him off, because that first explosion of violence was so shocking, so dramatic, so utterly horrifying that you couldn't possibly have imagined it was like going from 0 to 60 in 2 seconds.
A new family to the neighborhood became his first victims.
The Otero family had recently moved to Wichita because they wanted a new start. This was the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. But unfortunately, this was to be very short-lived, because one day the teenage children arrive home to the most horrendous scene.
On January the 15th, 1974, Wichita police were called to the scene. Detective Tim Ralph was one of the task force investigators on the BTK case in later years.
At the Otero house, they were actually called by the children. The 3 older children had come home, and they had found their mother and father. They called, and the first responders, or the first people that arrived at that time, they went to the bedroom, they found the father and the mother.
The scene they discovered was horrendous. Dennis Rader had broken into the family home and murdered everyone in the house in a way that would become his trademark.
He ties up husband and wife with a Venetian blind cord, suffocates them.
The older children didn't want their younger siblings to come home and find this because they thought they were at school. And so the officers went to their elementary schools in the area and found that both of the younger siblings had not made it to school that day.
When officers searched the house, it soon became clear that the parents weren't the only victims. 9-year-old Joseph and his sister Josephine, 11, were both found murdered.
Their 11-year-old daughter is found hanging in the basement, whether he killed her by hanging her or strangled her and then strung up the body. We have a situation where he's created elaborate knotwork and hung the body up. It's almost like some sort of macabre art display.
Rader appeared to have fixated on the younger daughter, Josephine, because he seems to have spent the most time with her body. She was the prize, and the others were just obstacles that he had to get out of the way.
He kills the boy, ties him up, leaves on the floor of his bedroom, again suffocated.
Rader had killed 4 members of the Otero family: 38-year-old Joseph, 33-year-old Julie, 9-year-old Joseph Jr., and 11-year-old Josephine.
The Otero case provided an overall mindset of this person, that he certainly was into some kind of binding fantasy.
The way Rader had killed the family showed the beginnings of what would become his modus operandi.
The police found semen at the scene, so there was clearly a sexual element to this offending. And they also discovered that the faces of some of the victims were quite bloated, which suggests that the killer strangled them and then stopped strangling them and then strangled them again. So literally holding them on the edge of life and death, watching the life drain out of them and then giving it back. So having that power over somebody's survival or somebody's demise is something that this killer very much enjoyed.
This was not, sadly, the act of a madman. It was the first of a series of killings in Wichita that would come to terrify the town.
With few clues as to what had happened or why, the Wichita police were baffled. Just a few months later, in April 1974, Rader struck again.
Rader starts escalating in the classic profile system. Catherine Bright, who's 21 years old, good looking, he forces his way into the house with a gun. Catherine and her brother, Kevin, return at lunchtime to their house.
And he forces Kevin to tie Catherine to a chair and begins to struggle with Kevin. Kevin is fighting back, and Rader really doesn't like this, so he shoots Kevin in the head. Now, miraculously, Kevin survives and he's able to flee and summon help, but unfortunately, it's too late for his sister Catherine.
I think he tried to bind her up, but it just wasn't working, and the whole thing just came unraveled, and he would take out a knife and he would very viciously stab her several times. And then he left thinking that he had killed her, and I don't think he realized that Kevin had run out. And Kevin got a hold of a neighbor who called the police. When the first officers got there, Catherine was still alive, but she was barely breathing, and she couldn't identify her attacker, and she was taken to the hospital, and she died in surgery just a couple hours after that.
She's bound, she is tortured, and she's eventually killed.
Catherine's brother, Kevin, was the first person to give clues as to Rader's identity to police.
He describes a white male, 180 pounds. We were looking for a single person. You were looking for this white male in his late 20s.
Could cover a description of quite a lot of men in Wichita, Kansas. But at least it's something. Rader once again slips behind the mask, returns to being a pillar of the community. The police are left struggling.
With no substantial leads and a brutal killer still at large, it was only a matter of time before Dennis Rader struck again.
In January, they have the Otero killings. In April, they have Catherine's killing and Kevin's attack. They have no idea what they have on their hands. I don't imagine they get an awful lot of these kinds of attacks in Wichita.
By the end of the year, the police thought they'd had a breakthrough in their investigation of the killings.
In October 1974, and the police arrest 3 men on the suspicion of the Otero killings. Rader is furious. This is an outrage. Those were my killings. Nobody else. It's not absolutely not acceptable. You can almost hear him saying it to himself. This is not right.
Incensed that his murders were being attributed to someone else, Rader wrote a letter to the local newspaper, the Wichita Eagle, and hid it inside a textbook at the Wichita Public Library. He then phoned the Otero murder hotline to describe where the letter could be found.
In his letter, claiming credit for the Otero killings, it's not quite well written. It's clumsy, misspelt, bad grammar, but the overall motive is absolutely clear.
Rader attempted to justify the killings with the phrase, "I can't stop it, so the monster goes on and hurt me as well as society. Society can be thankful that there are ways for people like me to relieve myself at time by daydreams of some victims being torture and being mine." Understanding the fear he was causing, Rader went one step further and gave his murderous alter ego a name.
He wanted a brand, he wanted an identity. He didn't just want to be a nameless killer. So he didn't want to get caught, and he also wanted recognition for his crime. So he had to come up with a moniker: bind, torture, kill.
Dennis Rader was to be known as BTK, and as he communicated with the press, Rader made a chilling threat that he was to strike again.
He'd gone to work for a security company, installing home security kits. Well, you can imagine what the residents of Wichita were doing at this moment. Suddenly, there's a serial killer on the loose. What are they going to be doing?
They bought elaborate security systems and burglar alarms, which actually turned out to be quite ironic because the killer who was targeting the victims had actually worked for a security company. So the very person who should have been invested in keeping people safe was the one who we had to watch out for.
It would, however, be nearly 3 years before Rader killed again.
In 1977, Rader murders Shirley Vayne. Now, she's a 26-year-old mother of 3. Rader follows home Shirley's 5-year-old son.
Once again, he forces his way into her house.
He locks the children in the bathroom and he proceeds to torture and kill Shirley.
The children are screaming in the bathroom. The only thing you must be grateful for in imagining this horrifying scene is they couldn't actually see what was happening to their mother.
Once again, Rader used strangulation to claim his victim. It was becoming increasingly clear that Rader had an obsession with tying ropes as part of his murderous action.
This is so far outside normal experience. The body seems to be almost secondary to displaying his skill at tying knots.
Yet again, Rader disappears the scene as if a ghost. There's no clear forensic evidence. It's a random killing.
Later that year, on December the 8th, 1977, with the police still having no clue about his identity, Rader would strike again.
After the murder of Shirley Vayne, Rader kills Nancy Fox. She's a 25-year-old secretary, and he'd likely stalked her for some time. He's getting better at his offending at this point in time.
He's looking at the house. He cuts the phone lines outside. He waits for her inside the house. He waits until she gets home. She is, if you like, the archetypal BTK victim.
He broke into her house, completely invading her privacy. He tied her up, he strangled her with a belt, he masturbated at the scene. But that wasn't all. He actually called the police. So there is a tape of Dennis Rader's voice. So they have the voice of the offender.
Yes, you will find a homicide South Pershing, Nancy Fox. I'm sorry, sir, I can't understand you. What is the address? South Pershing. That is correct.
This is Rader celebrating once again his own power. Here he is, swaggering. There can be no other word for it. That he knows something that nobody else knows, and he's taken another life.
Within 4 years, Rader had murdered 7 people, and yet the police had nothing to go on bar odd clues and a crackly voice recording. He had continued to evade capture and baffle the police, but he wanted more.
Rader sees all of the attention that serial killers like Ted Bundy are getting, and I think he wants a slice of that action. But he wants to be more than Ted Bundy, more than the other serial killers. And I think that's very much what drives his offending and the form that that takes.
A month after Nancy's death, Rader sends a note to the local television station in which he explains that he can close her eyes so that she can pass away. I mean, it's an act of the most extraordinary vanity. And again refers in the note to the television station to, "I'll be doing it again."
Those 7 murders back in 1978 became directly attributed to BTK, and he had made several communications. He'd sent them through the local paper at the time, so those 7 were always attributed to him.
Local police detective Randy Stone noticed that Rader was enjoying the attention that he was getting.
He liked watching himself on TV. So, communicating with the news media was part of his way of achieving the notoriety and being publicized and everything. And he enjoyed watching himself on TV, and he favored the news media that had the best signal reception on his television.
I think one of the things that sustains Rader's appetite for publicity is that he knows full well that he's not just terrifying individual victims, he's terrifying the whole town. They are in absolute fear. The sales of his security systems are going up rapidly. It's quite clear that there is a serial killer at work. It's quite clear that all the victims are in Wichita, which is not a huge town. And it's quite clear the police have no suspects.
The community were particularly terrified by these murders because the police had to tell the community that there was a serial killer on the loose. They had to do this in order for people to take steps to keep themselves and their loved ones safe. The quiet and the peacefulness of 1970s suburbia really has been completely shaken by these murders.
After scores of officers investigating and thousands of man-hours, the police realized they had nothing to stop this killer. But then BTK seemed to have stopped himself. Years went by without any further sign from him. The case went cold. Could Dennis Rader have got away with it?
He disappears again, and indeed pretty much disappears completely. 2 years pass, 3.
Rader goes dormant for a period of time. Whether there are murders that aren't linked to him or not is a matter of speculation.
As the years went by without another attack from BTK, Wichita police called in the FBI.
The local police form a task force, which ironically they nickname Ghostbusters, to try and find whoever the killer is. They are singularly unsuccessful. They do not get anywhere near Rader.
The Ghostbusters team would keep investigating BTK for the next 3 years.
There was a theory that he was either in jail or dead or had left the area. That theory was the basis for Ghostbusters, was the basis for searching for men that had left the area after 1979.
Over 600 suspects were tracked by the task force, but none of them could be connected with the BTK murders. Questions and rumors began to swirl about BTK's fate, and with no more murders in the Wichita area, some considered the horror over.
So it isn't until 1985 that he kills again. But this time, he moves his victimology. Instead of a young woman, it's an older woman, 53, called Marine. In fact, she lives very close to Rader. Okay, he hasn't actually killed anybody for years. Can you imagine what must be building up inside that tortured mind?
With Marine Hedge, Rader is changing his modus operandi. Not only does he murder her, he then takes the body, of all places, to a church where he poses her in degrading positions and takes photographs and ultimately dumps the body. This is the use of a human being as an object, as a plaything.
BTK was back, still evading capture and growing in brazen confidence.
Rader dumps Nancy's body about 7 miles away in a ditch. Clearly takes some trophies, as is wont, and shows no regard for his victim whatever.
That case was not initially connected to BTK, mainly because it was a completely different part of town. It was a few miles outside of Wichita, and now it's, almost bordering Wichita, but at that time in a little city called Park City.
A year later, on the 16th of September 1986, Rader murdered 28-year-old Vicky Wegerly while she was at home with her 2-year-old son.
Rader spots a attractive 28-year-old mother called Vicky walking towards her house. We're not exactly sure how Rader got access to her, but what we do know is he did exactly what he's done before. Her husband is driving home for lunch. Their 2-year-old son is left in the house with the body of his dead mother. Her husband discovers the 2-year-old sitting on the floor on his own and goes into another room to discover his wife's body.
This time, BTK was not a suspect. Police initially believed this was a domestic homicide, and Vicky's husband was questioned. Judge Kevin O'Connor, who was Deputy District Attorney at the time, recalls the case.
Mr. Wegerly, her husband, was always considered to be a suspect. So at the time I became involved was when the DNA could be replicated, and so they had the ability to replicate the DNA so you would have enough to be able to test it without using up your full sample.
By the late 80s, police were beginning to have new technology to work with, and homicide cases like this were the first places it was being used.
We started to learn about things like DNA, and there was so much more, even video, and the computers came along, and the ability to track people through all those different mediums became something that we had to kind of look back and see if we could use some of that new technology for some of the old evidence.
The DNA from the scene soon proved the husband was innocent, and the Wegerly murder went unsolved. BTK had got away with murder again.
Rader disappears. No contact with the police, no contact with the local television station or the local newspapers. He sinks back into the facade that he's been presenting for so very long of being an upright citizen, married father of 2. Indeed, he doesn't kill again for 5 years.
Rader's final known murder occurred on the 19th of January 1991. The victim, 62-year-old Dolores E Davis.
Dolores doesn't entirely fit the picture with what he's been doing before.
She's older, quite a lot older. He's on a Cub Scout camp, which he slips away from, clearly supposed to give him an alibi. Once again, binds her, tortures her, and eventually kills her, this time with her own pantyhose. And he dumps her body a long way away. So the police find it difficult to fit a pattern here. This lady, Dolores, is again naked, dumped, but it's not anywhere near the house.
The scenes were different. He removed them from the house. He had to kind of move his victim. His ideal victim had to move to where he could control them more, and that meant a little bit more mature victim.
Police still had nothing that could help them identify the killer.
This time, Rader returns to the body and takes Polaroid pictures of the victim, all the while wearing a feminine mask. Yet again, the police are confused. Rader disappears again off the radar.
BTK had now murdered 10 people. He continued to roam the streets of Wichita, a free man for over a decade. But then in 2004, the 30th anniversary of his first murders ignites his ego once again.
A local is going to write a book called Nightmare in Wichita. If ever there was anything that was going to provoke Rader's vanity, it was going to be that somebody else was going to tell his story. No, if anyone's going to tell my story, it's going to be me.
Wichita, Kansas, 2004. The residents of this heartland U.S. town knew Dennis Rader as a church-going family man. But for decades, he was getting away with murder, binding, torturing, and killing his victims to build his own sick alter ego, BTK. It had been 30 years since his first murders.
The anniversary of the killing of the Otero family, one of the newspaper reporters did a story to say, here's the anniversary story, it's another year and it hadn't been solved. And evidently BTK read that story and read in the story that there was a book being written about it, kind of had the opinion that who's more qualified to write the book than him.
At this point, Rader resumes writing to the media. He wants to be back in the spotlight. He wants to be in control of the story. It's very, very important to him that he has credit for these crimes that he committed. He doesn't want anybody else taking away from that.
Rader wrote to the paper under his usual pseudonym, Bill Thomas Kilman, initials BTK, and included a copy of Vicky Wegerly's driving license and photos from the murder scene. This was the start of a trail of clues connecting Rader to all of his victims.
First of all, he leaves little items that he's taken from the scenes in unlikely places. He starts taunting the police, literally, saying, well, of course, you think you may know, but actually I know, and what's more, I can prove it. Here's some examples.
BTK had returned to tease the police, and they knew that this time they had to catch him. One of his communications allowed investigators to make a breakthrough.
He had left a cereal box at Home Depot here in Wichita.
He thought it was funny that to use cereal boxes because he's a serial killer.
Law enforcement went out to Home Depot and started doing some interviews. And one of the employees there said, yeah, he found something in the bed of his pickup truck, but he threw it out.
He took it home, opened it up, there was a doll, there was some other stuff in there, and he thought it was just some joke or prank, so he threw it away.
He didn't take the garbage down to the end of the driveway, and law enforcement was able to recover that package. And during the course of the investigation, Home Depot was able to provide us with a video of the parking lot. And so we were able to see a vehicle come in, and that vehicle could be identified as a Jeep Cherokee or a similar type vehicle. That was important to us because that was information at that time that law enforcement knew, but he didn't know law enforcement knew.
The police finally had sight of BTK, but with grainy, unclear CCTV footage, it was the smallest of clues. In an effort to keep himself hidden, BTK's communication methods were becoming increasingly complicated.
The police and he start communicating through small ads in the Wichita Eagle. Finally, he asks the police in one of the communications, what if I were to give you a floppy disk with more details of the killings? Could you identify me?
He asked us, be honest, because the police can't lie. Well, we can lie if we're catching a serial killer. And then he was told, you can send us whatever you want. We won't trace it.
BTK sent a disc to the local TV station. The police took a look, and suddenly, with this one mistake, the case was blown wide open.
We were contacted by KSAS Fox TV, and they had received a package. They didn't initially recognize it as being from him, but then when they opened it up and saw the contents, which included the floppy disk, they called the police department. They called me and said, hey, we got a floppy disk.
And I remember, and will never forget, being present when the disk was put into the computer, and Randy Stone, the computer expert, went through the language on the disk, which is beyond me.
You know, at the time, I'm sitting in a little cubicle, facing the laptop, doing thing, and I look behind me and there's like 20 people all crowded around a semicircle around me. So it's one of those no pressure, don't screw this up type of things. So I imaged it, and I opened up the image and started looking through it, and there's the file on there, testa.rtf, which was a Microsoft Office, or it's a Word document file.
And then you see Dennis, and then more gibberish, and you see Christ Lutheran Church. When you saw that, there was another detective sitting next to Randy, who then Googled the Christ Lutheran Church, and there up in the corner of their website was a picture of the president of the church, Dennis. I still get goosebumps remembering that, because you're looking at that and going, that's him.
Finally, the team had a suspect. Now they had to prove Dennis Rader was BTK.
So then we were off and running. We learned that Rader had an address in Park City, and we went down the street that Rader was said to have lived on. You remember that little vehicle that was in the Home Depot parking lot? It was in Rader's driveway. At that point is when you knew, you didn't know how this was going to end, but you knew we'd caught him. And I made a phone call I didn't think I'd ever be able to make, but I called Kenny and I said, we got him.
But police still didn't have enough to make an arrest. They needed hard proof that Dennis Rader was the BTK killer.
They had got no probable cause to demand a DNA sample from Rader, so they take the unlikely step of going to the hospital, asking for a cervical smear that his daughter had given, and comparing the DNA that they got from various crime scenes, the semen they'd found. And they find that it's extremely close. The match is must be a family member.
The police could finally move in.
A large contingent of people were sent toward Park City on February the 25th of 2005. And at 12:15, he was taken into custody.
Rader is finally arrested and is eventually charged with 10 murders, including the Oteros.
The police had many crimes they suspected Rader and his alter ego BTK of committing. But at that time, only he knew the full extent of the truth. The interrogation was a delicate affair.
We had broken up the case into several different sections, so we started to rotate in investigators, and he would be more than a year and talked for almost 34 hours. And he almost saw himself as an instructor of, as he called it, the golden age of serial killing.
When they're done with the interviews, I'm back from doing my search warrants. He's in the interview room, and they put the vest on him, and they're hooking him up with the shackles and belly chain and that kind of thing. And I just kind of stuck my head in the door and said, it's nice to be able to put a face go along with the name that I found on the floppy disk. And he looks up, and he's kind of got the shackles like that, and looks up, so you're the one, huh? And I said, yeah, I'm the one. So we kind of joked back and forth. And he was in a good mood. He was joking, and he said, if I ever get out of here, I'm gonna have to find you and stuff your mouth full of a case of floppy disks.
Finally, the infamous BTK was off the streets and in custody.
So we took him over to the jail. Everybody in the holding cells and area in there knew that it happened. The cells in there are all glassed off, and so all the inmates in there, they all come up to the glass, and they're looking at the glass, and then they start pounding on the glass, chanting his name, pounding on the glass, going, BTK, BTK. And then he's got a big old smile, and he's got his hands there, he goes, 2 thumbs up, he's 2 thumbs up to everybody chanting his name. So, he just loved that.
On the 1st of March 2005, Dennis Rader had been charged with the murders of the Otero family, Catherine Bright, Shirley Vayne, Nancy Fox, Maureen Hedge, Vicky Wegerly, and Dolores E Davis.
When he first is charged and formally brought before a judge, he refuses to say anything, to plead. So the judge pleads not guilty for him. Rader says nothing. That was in March 2005. In June 2005, he's finally brought to trial. But before the trial properly begins, Rader changes his plea.
So he did not necessarily want to have a hearing. He pled guilty to the murders. and he tried to avoid any type of hearing whatsoever. The district attorney thought that it was very important that the community knows what happened, and the best way to do that is to have a public hearing, because once it's a public hearing, then it's open.
Now, the monster is really out of the bottle, because Rader is perfectly prepared to accept that he's got away with it for 30 years and that he's going to go down in history as BTK. And what's more, he's going to make sure the world knows just how evil he was.
During the hearing, Rader described the murders, showing little remorse and with no apology, to the horror of viewers.
Most of these sentencing hearings take a couple of hours. This one took 3 days, and they would present evidence from the murders and really just kind of combine, this is what we had at the crime scene, this is what his confession says. And it was just to kind of confirm to the community, this is really him, this is what happened.
And then you had an opportunity for the victims and their families to make a statement, and it was just truly heartbreaking and painful. But hopefully it helped them that finally, after all these years, the person that had murdered their loved one was done, was going to prison.
Rader was sentenced to 10 consecutive life sentences with a minimum term of 175 years. He remains in solitary confinement, where he will stay for the rest of his life.
One of my favorite shots is him being led into the penitentiary over in El Dorado, Kansas.
There is something about Rader that genuinely chills the soul. And something about that look in his eyes. I can never, ever get it out of my mind. That little smirk, that little glimmer of, I'm better than you. I really am God. I'm not only the devil, I am God as well.
Dennis Rader crafted a depraved alter ego that terrified a whole generation. But it was his own arrogance that would eventually be his undoing. For over 30 years, he was one of the world's most elusive criminals, taunting the police and teasing the press. He brutally murdered 10 people, including 2 children, by binding, torturing, and killing them, all to fit his sick brand, BTK, and make him one of the world's most evil killers.